Okay, welcome again to OneShul, everybody. I'm Brian. Thank you for joining me again for a Monday night mitzvot here, or our weekly Torah study here at OneShul. Before we begin tonight, I'm going to say the normal blessing for studying Torah. If you want to join in with me, please feel free. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kadishanu b'mitzvotav la'asot b'divrei Torah. Okay, so this week our Torah Parsha is the Parsha of Vayechi, which is the book of Genesis, chapters 47, verse 28 through 50, verse 26. And this Parsha actually brings the book of Genesis to a close. Now, I'm just going to go over I'll just give you the nutshell, the Cliff Note version of the story, just to bring you up to speed. It begins with the final 17 years of Jacob's life. Okay, Jacob lives the final 17 years of his life in Egypt, and before his passing, he asked Joseph, his son, who he'd been reunited with after believing he had been dead for many years now. He asked his son Joseph to take an oath that after Jacob's passing, that Joseph will take his body back up to the Holy Land in Canaan, and he'll bury him there. He blesses Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and when he does this, he adopts them and elevates them to the status of his own sons. And he does this so they can be the progenitors of the tribes of the nation within Israel. The patriarch Jacob, he desires to reveal the happenings of the end of days to his children and what's going to happen in the future and everything, but he's prevented from doing so is that he dies before he's able to. So Jacob blesses his sons, assigning to each his role as a tribe of Israel. Judah will produce leaders, legislators, and kings. Now it's of the tribe of Judah, and through Judah's line, that all the kings will come, and eventually King David will come, and it is prophesied and told to us that when the eventual Messiah comes, that the Messiah will come of King David's line. The priests will come from the tribe of Levi. Scholars will come from the tribe of Issachar. Seafarers from Zebulun, school teachers from Simeon, soldiers from Gad, judges from Dan, olive growers from Asher, and so on. His son Reuben is rebuked for confusing his father's marriage bed. Simeon and Levi are also rebuked for the massacre of Shechem and the plot against Joseph. Because if you recall back, they were the head honchos that were in charge of the whole plot to originally murder Joseph, and then they decided to sell him into slavery instead to make a profit off it. Instead of just killing him, they thought, hey, we can make some money off this, so they did that. Naphtali is granted the swiftness of a deer, Benjamin the ferociousness of a wolf, and Joseph is blessed with beauty and fertility. So at this point then, the large funeral procession consisting of all Jacob's descendants, Pharaoh and his ministers, and the leading citizens of Egypt and the Egyptian cavalry all accompany Jacob on his final journey to be buried in the Holy Land, where he's buried in the cave at Machpelah in Hebron, which is the cave that Abraham purchased from the hill people there to bury his wife Sarah. And Abraham was eventually laid to rest and buried in that cave, and then his son Isaac and Isaac's wife Rebekah was buried there too. Yes, Isaac's wife. I always confuse Rachel and Rebekah. Isaac's wife Rebekah was born there as well. Was buried there. Well, that was a bad mistake. Rebekah was buried there as well, and so Jacob was taken there then to be buried. So he was literally laid to rest with his fathers in the Promised Land. Eventually, as the story progresses on, Joseph too dies in Egypt. He dies at the age of 110. He too instructs that his bones be taken up out of Egypt and buried in the Holy Land. Now, but this would only come to pass many years later with the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. Before his passing, Joseph conveys to the children of Israel the testament from which they will draw their hope and faith in the difficult years to come. And that is the testament and the promise from God that God will surely remember you and bring you out of this land and into the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He reaffirms, the promises that God made, that, you are to be my chosen people, and I will take you back to the land you came from, because, at this point they came down from Canaan to Egypt to escape the famine, because Egypt was the only place in the world where there was food to be procured. But the idea is that God still is going to keep good with his promise to eventually take them up out of Egypt and bring them back to the promised land. Now, as I said earlier, the book of Genesis actually concludes with this week's Parsha, and when we meet again next, we'll move into the story of Exodus, which actually details the birth of the actual nation of Israel. So at this point, all is well in Egypt for the descendants of Jacob, who at this point is also known as Israel. And when I speak of his descendants, I mean basically us, the Jewish people. Okay? All is well with the Jews in Egypt at the time, currently. But however, at this point, they don't know this yet, but we know now is that the 400 years of Egyptian enslavement is just literally right around the corner. Things are going to get a whole lot worse before they get better at this point. Our parsha for this week begins with Jacob having been in Egypt with the rest of the house of Israel now for 17 years. Okay. Israel had come down to Egypt in the second year of the Great Famine, and that's because, to procure food, and then they found out that Joseph was still alive, and they all came down to be with Joseph, because Pharaoh loved and was so happy and so pleased with Joseph and how Joseph basically ran Egypt that he invited all of Joseph's brothers to come down, and Joseph's father, and them to all come down into Egypt and to live there among the Egyptians off the fat of the land. Now, as I said, Israel had come down to Egypt in the second year of the Great Famine. And so at this point, there were still 5 years of the Great Famine that remained. Okay, only 2 years had passed. The 5 remaining years of the famine then passed. Yet after it ended, all the Israelites still remained in Egypt. They stayed there. It's interesting to ponder, and I'll put this before you guys to see what you guys have to say about it. Why do you suppose that the Israelites, after the famine passed and everything, why do you suppose that they remained there in Egypt instead of returning to Canaan once the famine had ceased? Why could you suppose that God didn't put it in the minds of any of the Israelites at the time to return to the promised land now that the 7 years of famine were over? Instead they stayed there. Does anybody have any idea why they think that, instead of, they could have just been like, well, okay, famine's over, thanks for helping us out, Egypt, but we're going to go back to our home now. But instead, they stayed there for like another 12 years at this point after that. Anybody have any idea why do you think that they would stay there instead of going back to Canaan, which was basically their ancestral homeland at this point and basically was the land that God had promised to them? Why would you think that they would stay there? Anybody have any idea? Well, God had the nation of Israel. He decided to have them remain in Egypt, and it was like as a means to protect them. Aubrey says, I imagine they stayed due to Joseph's favor with Pharaoh, and they saw no urgent need or reason to return. That makes a lot of sense. That's a good thought on that. Also, I found, and a lot of the midrash and commentary says about this too, is that God had the nation of Israel remain in Egypt also as a means to protect them. You got to keep in mind and understand the idea that, of the years that Israel had been in Egypt up until this point, yeah, there were more generations and they had grown, but they were still relatively small. Even with the eventual enslavement of Israel in Egypt, keeping Israel there in Egypt at the time, it ensured their survival and growth, because they were literally sheltered under the roof of what at the time was the most powerful and prosperous nation in the world. That was the nation of Egypt. Okay, if they had left, immediately after the famine had ended, if once the famine broke and everything, and the land started producing again, was able to live off of again, if they would have been like, okay, well, thanks for being our lifeboat, Egypt, during this hard time, but we're gonna go back to our homeland now. We're not gonna stay here with you. We're gonna go back home now. If they had left immediately after the famine ceased, there's no guarantee that Israel would have survived. They could have got back to Canaan and found it overrun with whoever may have decided to move in there. Next after that, the area could still be uninhabitable. So there's no guarantee that if they would have went back to Canaan then at that point, that they would have survived. Basically, if they had left immediately after the famine ceased, there was no surety that there was any land or area that was inhabitable or good enough to go back to. It kind of works with the idea of how, when a child is born, into a household, that child remains in that household until reaching maturity and having gained the ability to venture out on its own. It's the whole, your kid living in your parents' house idea, it'll stay there until reaches maturity and having gained the ability to venture out into the world on its own. Until that time is reached, it needs to be sheltered and protected and stay under its literal or figurative parent's roof and remain in the house of its birth, even sometimes if that means that it has to endure some hardship. And as we know already, just being Jews as we know, but also as the Torah is going to tell us again as we read through the story again, we know that there's a lot of hardship ahead for the Israelite people in Egypt. So, story turns to Jacob here. Now, Jacob's 147 years old. Oh, what's Aubrey have to say here? Aubrey says, this may be a bit blunt, but it's worth asking. Also, there'd be no opportunity for God to show off during the Exodus, which led to Sinai, and backed all that would follow. Is that a protection or a suffering, which surely was known to the Omnipotent to result in the suffering, which would prove to be necessary for the overall arc of history? Should we assume it was for protective effect? Or no, the Midrash would usually try to read it that way, but is that assumption valid? I'd say that the assumption is valid, but the wonderful thing about the rabbis of the Midrash is I've read many Midrash where you'll see one rabbinic commentary and then another one that I don't want to say they contradict, but they disagree with each other. Like one Midrash will have a take seeing it this way, another Midrash will have a take seeing it more this way. And the wonderful thing about it is that neither is considered wrong, and neither one is considered completely right. It is valid to say that, yeah, it is, protection and everything. Also, it works with the ideas that, sometimes to know suffering and hardship gives you a greater appreciation of joy and happiness. Maybe with, leaving Israel there and eventually having them, suffer and go through what they did. It made for them, when they finally got that first taste of true freedom, it makes it all the more sweet. It's the whole idea that says, you wouldn't appreciate a beautiful sunny day as much if it weren't for dark and cloudy, rainy days. Works along that idea. So back to our patriarch Jacob. Oh, Darian says it's all very open to interpretation. 10 people will read 10 different meanings into a single sentence. Darian, you're so right. I think that actually lends to the wonder and the beauty of our faith, is that there's no wrong way to interpret the Torah, as so long as your interpretation is not in any hateful or derogatory means or anything like that. I think it was Rabbi Hillel who answered the question one time where someone asked him point blank when they said, what is the overall message and the overall overriding theme of the Torah? And the rabbi thought for a few moments, and he said that the overall theme of the Torah was simply, that which is hateful to you, do not do unto your neighbor. Now go study. So that right there tells you that, as long as you're interpreting the Torah in a way that, promotes loving kindness, basically in a way that helps to move the world towards messianic perfection, then there's no wrong way to interpret the Torah if you're interpreting it from that frame of mind. Okay, and now on to our patriarch Jacob. At this point in the story, Jacob is at the ripe old age of 147 years old. And as the Torah tells us, he had been living in Egypt for the last 17 years of his life. Now, at this point, Jacob then, they said his eyes are very dim. He's very old and he's almost blind at this point. And Jacob finally passes away. He finally dies. Now, before his death, he summons Joseph before him and proclaims that Joseph's two sons, who are Manasseh and Ephraim, that they will henceforth be counted not as Joseph's sons, but Jacob symbolically, in a way, adopts them and says that your two sons, your first two sons that you had, Manasseh and Ephraim, they are now my sons. Okay, they're no longer your sons, they're my sons. I'm adopting them, and forever, from this point on, they will forever be known as my sons through my late beloved wife, Rachel. Where am I here? So yes, as I said, henceforth they'll be counted as his sons, and he adopted them and made them his sons, so that they could be heads of the two senior tribes of Israel. And this was done to replace Reuben and Simeon, who were the oldest and should have rightfully been the leaders of the elder tribes of Israel. But both of these two sons had earned rebuke from their father for their actions. Okay, now it does make one wonder. Okay, if Jacob is the patriarch, okay, and if he could pretty much, he's the head of the family, and he is blessed from God And that, I mean, this guy, he literally actually talks to God face to face. He has visions of God. God comes to him. They speak to each other. Okay, Jacob could have just basically decreed that Joseph, your two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, they will be the heads of the two senior tribes of Israel. Okay, but instead of, he could have just done that, and his word would have been law over the family, and it would have been law over all of the young burgeoning nation of Israel. But instead, he could have just decreed it, and it would be. But instead, he actually takes the time and makes the measure of physically adopting Joseph's two sons as his own, with Rachel as their mother. Okay? Now, as I said, Jacob could have just put the decree out, and that would have been that, but he goes through the whole rigmarole of adopting these two and declaring them to be his sons. Why do you guys think that he would do that? Why could if he could have just said, "Hey, you two, technically my grandsons right now, you two will get the charge of the head two senior tribes of Israel," but instead he actually adopts them and takes them as his own son. Why do you guys? Do you have any thoughts on why you think that he would have done that? There actually is a very, very good and valid reason under Jewish law and Jewish tradition that he does that. I'll give you a few more seconds to think about it. Nobody have any idea? Okay, well, here's why Jacob did what he did, and why he actually physically took Manasseh and Ephraim to be his own sons through his wife Rachel. Okay. By declaring Manasseh and Ephraim to be his own sons through his beloved wife Rachel, it would replace their birth mother, who their birth mother was the Egyptian woman named Asenath. If Asenath were to remain their mother, then technically, under Jewish law, Manasseh and Ephraim would not have been considered Jewish. Because how Jewish law works is that Jewish lineage is passed on not through the father, but through the mother. So these two had to have a Jewish mother, whether being actually born to a Jewish mother or adopted by a Jewish mother. Okay, you have to have a Jewish mother to be under the law at this time. You had to have a Jewish mother to be considered Jewish. Okay, they couldn't have the heads of two elder ancestral tribes of Israel not be Hebrews, not be Jews. They had to be Jewish. So by adopting them as his sons through Rachel, it means that symbolically they not only had a Jewish father, but that their mother was a born Jew, was Jewish. So that meant that they could be considered Jewish as well. Because up until this point, concerning Manasseh and Ephraim, even though Joseph was their father, Joseph is a Hebrew, okay, but because they were born from an Egyptian woman, okay, they technically, under Jewish law up until this point, would not have been considered to be Jews. So they needed a Jewish mother to do this. Aubrey asked, doesn't that date to Ezra and the end of the first exile, though, and not this far back? How does the adoption by Jacob Israel affect matrilineally? Well, Here is the wonderful thing, Aubrey, about how the rabbis work within the Jewish tradition. The rabbis of the Midrash have absolutely no issue with, you know, making things jump around in the timeline. You know, there are stories in the Midrash where it tells us of, and you know, the spirit of, I believe in one story it's the spirit of the prophet Elijah, who comes to Moses as a child. Okay, now mind you, Moses lived long before the prophet Elijah did, but the rabbis have no problem with, you know, moving things around, and they don't see a whole necessary idea with, you know, it's sticking with the timeline. So in the midrash, then they could, you know, enforce the idea that, you know, that Jacob did what he did to support and stay in line with the idea of how Jewish lineage was passed even before the idea even came up. So it's one of these, you know, how they wiggle around, you know, if the midrash doesn't exactly jive with what the text actually says, that's how they're able to do that. Hope that it sounds crazy, but um, it kind of allows you to put things more into perspective and sort of give a more coherent understanding. It all sort of comes together in a cohesive sort of way. If you look at it from the idea that, you know, they don't stick to the exact straight timeline, they can jump all over the place, and where, you know, they can, you know, have ideas and stories like here being forced even years before they actually came into the world through the Torah, basically before they were written down in the holy books, basically. Where are we at here? Okay. So it says, by declaring Manasseh and Ephraim to be his sons through his beloved wife Rachel, it would replace their birth mother, the Egyptian woman Asenath. If Asenath were to remain their mother, Manasseh and Ephraim would not be counted as Jewish, and Jewish Hebrew lineage is passed through the mother, not by the father. Okay. Thus, Manasseh and Ephraim replaced Reuben and Simeon as the senior tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel, because, as I said earlier, Reuben had been rebuked for confusing his father's marriage bed, and Simeon had been rebuked for his savage acts of violence against the city of Shechem when he acted against Jacob's will. Darian says, even if matrilineal descent did not exist back then, adopted by sons, Jacob bonded them to him and the Jewish people more than they would if Jacob simply issued a decree. Being welcomed into a family, then ordered by law to lead tribes strengthens a bond more. I say that's very right, Darian. Thank you for pointing that out and bringing that up. You know, it shows the idea of, you know, family unity in a way, and just love for one another. You know, it's not just to say, you know what, I love you enough that, you know, even though you're not my son, you're my grandson, but I still love you enough that I'm going to make you a tribe, give you a tribe, and set you over my own actual sons. You know, that's cool. He could do that, but it says, you know, it's a symbol of family love and solidarity a whole lot more if you say, to basically be like, you know what, I love you so much that, you know, I'm going to take you as my own son. That makes it all the more, like you said, Darren, makes it all more bonding. It basically makes it more concrete and sets up a real solid foundation for what will eventually become the nation of Israel in a very short time. So at this point, Jacob blesses his sons and assigns each of them a tribe. And we're told that Jacob desires to tell his sons of the end of days. But it's told to us that God takes Jacob before he is able to do so. Here it's basically implied that that in some way God imparted wisdom and knowledge of the future events on Jacob. Basically like what would happen with all the tribes of Israel. What would eventually happen to Israel in general, and it's hinted at too that God actually made Jacob aware and let him know of the exact time of when the Messiah would come. And that's what it means when we speak of, of Jacob wanting to tell his sons about the end of days. Okay? The whole end of days thing, when I say that here, I'm saying it in a very Jewish perspective too. This isn't to be confused in any way with the end of days from the Christian faith and the Christian Bible, which that's just their end of days idea. It's a horror show. It's a horror show scenario with just terrible horrors, violence, and suffering. That's not ours. We don't have that at all. There when we speak of, as the Jewish people, when we speak of the end of days, it refers to the time with the coming of the Messiah and the completion of a now perfected world. We're told that when Messiah comes, that the world will be perfected and completed, and that all wars will stop, all death, suffering, violence, misery in the world, that will all stop. The world will be forever vastly noticeably changed for the better. And all the wars and everything will stop. There'll be no more hunger, no more suffering, no more disease, and no more death. Death itself will stop, and that all the nations of the world will realize that the wrongs they've done to Israel in the past, and they'll turn to Israel for spiritual guidance. And we're taught that in these times that all of the Jews, that will all know Torah without the need for study, that it'll be written in our hearts, and we'll know it automatically without the need to study for it. And we're also told that through the Messiah, the third temple will be built, and it'll be built on the Temple Mount where the first two stood in Jerusalem, and that all the knowledge of God will fill the earth, and that right now God is all, but right now we're told that where God exists, that God right now currently resides outside of space and time. We're told that in the Messianic era, when Messiah comes and rebuilds the third temple and the world is perfected, that as he did with the first two temples, that the Spirit of God will come down to earth and rule and actually reside in the temple and rule from the temple. That is the idea. That's the Jewish sort of end of days idea, or end of days scenario. It's not like a whole big thing of like death and terror and destruction and only certain people getting called up to heaven or whatever. It'll happen right here on earth, okay? And instead of in other faiths, Christianity being an example, instead of God coming down and wrathful judgment and destroying the world, the world is perfected. So the world is perfected so that God can come in and create, on top of that, a new heaven and a new earth that is, perfect. I mean, perfection beyond anyone's wildest dreams, honestly. Now, it's in this passage from the Torah that we first really, get the real concrete demonstration of the Jewish tradition, our tradition, in the belief of and the hope of a coming Messiah. and of the messianic age to come, of the perfect world. The rabbis refer to the coming messianic age and the coming perfect world. They refer to it as Olam Haba, which literally means the world to come. This is the first real solid example that we find in the Torah where that idea is really, really hinted at and demonstrated in a way. So after doing all these things, Jacob, he makes Joseph swear to bury him in the promised land in Canaan at the Machpelah cave in Hebron. And then after Joseph swears to do that to him, Jacob finally takes his last breath and he finally passes away at the age of 147 years old. Now, moving on in our story, then we have Joseph's brothers. Now their father is gone. Okay, now his brothers now fear that with their father gone, that Joseph might exact some long overdue retribution for their crimes against him, basically what they did to him in their youth. Because we all remember the murder plot, then throw him in the pit and everything, then selling him off into slavery. They're still worried. His brothers are still worried that Joseph is still plotting some long overdue vengeance on them, and that now with their father gone, that there's nothing to they're fearing there's nothing to stop Joseph, because maybe Joseph didn't do anything right now because our dad was still here and he didn't want to upset dad by doing it, but now dad's gone, so what's to stop him now? Now Joseph, having forgiven them obviously for these actions, reaffirms this to them both verbally and physically. He verbally reaffirms it by continuing to speaking kindly to them, and he physically reaffirms this by his continued kind treatment of his brothers and their families, because they all have families of their own at this point. Joseph again also, he reminds them, his brothers, that ultimately that it was not by their hand that their actions were taken against him, but rather that it was all part of God's plan to bring about a way to save Israel from perishing in Egypt. Again, this reinforces to us the idea and the teaching that, number one, that God is the great orchestrator of all events, okay, and that only God himself can use actions of human evil, okay, as a means to bring about an ultimate greater goodness. Sure, we as people can, in a way, take a human tragedy or a human act of evil comes along. Okay, we can learn from that, and we can take that and use it as a means to bring a greater good out of a bad thing. Okay, only God himself can allow an act of evil to happen, and it be a means to a greater end. It's like we as people, we can't go out and allow something evil to happen or do something evil to happen and think, well, if this happens, it'll spur people to create a greater good from that. We can't do that. God can, by allowing it to happen. We're told in Isaiah that God himself says that I create the light and the dark, I create good and evil, all these things I create. So that tells us a little bit about how the mind of God works. We can't completely understand it because our ways of thinking are a lot different than his, but at least gives us a little bit of insight, is that this is one of those things that God can do and we can't do in the exact same way, nor should we ever attempt to on certain things. We shouldn't go out and do evil or allow evil to happen in the hope or knowledge that a greater good would come from this, because we're not God. We could be wrong. Also shown to us here again is also the idea that in most cases, okay, And where most cases where, yes, you do have the right to, avenge yourself if something is done wrong to you. Okay? There's the whole idea of, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, all that thing. Okay? But, where you do have the right to avenge yourself, and forgiving a person and just the general idea of forgiveness, it's not something that, is told to us that, you must do this. Where other faiths, have the thing where it's like, the whole turn the other cheek idea that you must forgive. That is not commanded upon us, but it's always a preferred course of action. I tend to look at it as of the idea where, we have the commandments and the 613 mitzvot and everything. There's a lot of really straight yes or no rules. There's a whole bunch of, thou shalt, like thou shalt honor thy mother and thy father, thou shalt keep the Sabbath day. Those are strict, yes, do this, no wiggle room at all. And then there's also, conversely, there's also a whole lot of, thou shalt nots, like, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's, thou shalt not make a graven image, thou shalt not worship idols, things like that. Those are straight hardcore, no, don't do this. When it comes to the idea of, being forgiving and giving forgiveness, where it's not something that is in a way totally straight out, like, boom, you have to do this in every single case. I tend to look at it as more one of those things where I look at it as like God saying to us, you know what, it's one of those things where I'd rather you didn't do it. And it's a good idea, because I know we discussed in last week's Torah Parsha how actually good for you and healthy forgiveness is. Forgiveness isn't as much something that you do to let the other person off the hook. It's something that you do in a big way for yourself, because it allows you to, release and let a lot of that anger and aggression go that you may have, because, you're holding and bearing a grudge. There's also an Israelite ethic that actually forbids us from taking vengeance or bearing a grudge. And our story here, in our Torah story here, we see that Joseph is actually adhering to that. It's the idea that, forgiveness is a godly trait. And of course, we all know we honor God most when we walk in his ways. Joseph could have easily taken back his forgiveness now that his father was gone, and he could have made slaves of his brothers, and he could have, treated them harshly, maybe, given them the punishment that they rightfully deserved, because, they tried to murder him and made him a slave and sold him for money. This is their own brother. This is their own flesh and blood, and they gave him away for money. It's really it gives us the idea here that, maybe Joseph's brothers still have a guilty conscience. Maybe they haven't forgiven themselves, even though Joseph has forgiven them, and he's forgiven and almost in a way long forgot about it. It tells us really of the idea, hints at a psychological human idea here that, we've all been there in a situation where, sometimes, maybe we've done something inadvertently or whatever to hurt someone, and we've asked them, we've apologized to them, we've asked them for their forgiveness, and they're like, I accept your apology, I forgive you. They forget, the person who you wronged forgives you, and a lot of times a whole lot sooner and long before, and a lot of times you ultimately forgive yourself. So it's the idea that, forgive others, but, forgive yourself too when you've been forgiven. So at this point now, moving on, Joseph, now at 110, he finally dies. And before he dies, he makes the Israelites promise to take his bones to the promised land when Israel eventually returns there. Now, unfortunately for him, he has no way of knowing. This is going to take over 400 years plus to pass. Before taking his last breath, he assures the Israelites that God does and will remember them and will take them out of Egypt and return them to the land that he has promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that, of course, is the promised land of Canaan. This speaks to us and reminds us that even to this day, that God always makes good on his word. All the oaths, covenants, promises, whatever that God makes with us, he keeps. Now, what we have to bear in mind, and this is a hard thing for a lot of people. I know a lot of people who maybe start to question their faith, and even question God, question the existence of God. I know a lot of people that do this because they're like, God's good, God's supposed to take care of us. God made all these promises or whatever. What they have to remember is that, and what we all have to make sure we remember and keep in our minds, is that, yes, God always fulfills his promises. He always keeps his word. But he does it on his time, not ours. I will get back to that in a moment. However, it says, previous topic on the forgiveness issue. Took too long to type. Don't worry about it. It's all good. What's different about this from, say, the fate of Egypt in Exodus? That too credibly bears the claim of providence. Yet we say, but thanks for kicking. After all, Joseph's reason for forgiving his brothers is the same mechanism of God's promise at work. Why does God judge the Egyptians, yet Jacob is an example of humans releasing this right? Why he hold the right of some recompense is Joseph's place in judgment? Cut off my comment. Situation of Esther, situation and the sons of Haman. Wow, mind overload. That's such a good question. It goes so deep on so many levels too. Let me address the idea. I'm going to scroll back up to your question here so I can read it again and sort of diagnose it. Okay, with the Egyptian idea. Give me a second here while I think about this. That's just reason for forgiving his brothers and sins. I don't think it is much. I could be wrong, and you guys are open to whatever interpretation you are most comfortable with. Again, that's the wonderful part of our faith. When it comes to the Egyptians, in a way, I don't know if it's so much as God judging the Egyptians in a way, but more so using them as a tool in a way, basically as, I don't want to say a means to an end, because that discounts their lives and their value as human beings. But well, I know that there is. Hopefully I can explain with this. I just heard it recently, a teaching from a rabbi that says, this is from the Midrash as well, that as the Egyptians were chasing the Israelites through the Red Sea, okay, and Israel finally gets all safe up on the banks and everything, and God releases the waters, and the waters come crashing down all over the Egyptian army, and everyone in the Egyptian army, save for Pharaoh, eventually drowns in the water. That as the Egyptians are drowning in the water, the Midrash tells us that God weeps. And again, while he's weeping, as the Egyptians are drowning, that God cries. And what he says when he's crying is, he's just saying, my children, my children, my children. So that leads me to believe that it's not so much idea of judgment per se. I could be wrong, but using he used Egypt as a way not to empower Israel, but much like how he used Israel to display his might and his glory, it had to be displayed against somebody. So let's see the situation with Esther. Now the situation of Esther. We all know that Esther did some things that were not befitting of a Jewish woman. Number one, she married a non-Jewish king. In a way, it works with the ideas that she did what she had to do, and her actions were excused because, again, the idea of the greater good coming from it. With Esther, it's kind of like the Esther story reminds me of how with the laws of the Shabbat, how we are permitted to violate the law of the Shabbat to save a human life. We're not just permitted to do so, but we're actually, commanded to do so. In the situation with Esther, I would say that she was violating what law she had to, because to save all the Jewish people who were basically marked for death at that point. It's the idea is that we have the law, okay? We're to live by the law. We are not to die because of the law. Is Jacob a better example being Torah, or is justice for wrongs done ever just? Justice for wrongs done being just, I would say, is it ever just? Yeah, I would think so. There are times when basically in the Jewish tradition and our tradition and everything, there are times when doing a wrong can be excused. You can do wrong for the right reason, but there are also, as you asked, there are times is justice for wrongs done ever just? Yeah, there are lots of times when doing justice to punish a wrong is just. Okay, where are we at here? So like as I was saying before, the idea of God always keeps his promises, he keeps his oaths, his covenants he makes. What we have to keep in mind, okay, and like as I said before, I've known people who have lost their faith in God because of this. It's because they think that when God says, "I will surely do this," they think it means, oh, right now, or maybe tomorrow, or like next week or something. What they don't understand is that God will keep his promises, all his promises, his oaths, his covenants. If God says he'll do it, he will do it. But we have to learn and understand patience, and to understand that yes, God is going to do what he says he's going to do, but he's going to do it in his own time. Okay, God told Israel that we would be returned to the promised land from Egypt, and that took 400 years, but God still did it. It tells us of, I heard a great man say one time that patience is trusting God's timing. And to me, that is, one of the most poignant things I've ever heard. And it ties right into our teaching this evening, is that, yes, patience is trusting God's timing. God will fulfill all the things that he says he will fulfill. but he doesn't say when. Now, if God says, you know what, I will do this 1 week from now, and let's see, here in California right now where I'm at, it's 6:04 p.m. If God says to us 1 week from now on December 31st at 6:04 p.m. Pacific time, I will make it rain cats and dogs. Okay, if God says that and gives that exact time, you can bet your bottom dollar at 6:04 p.m. a week from now, we're going to see cats and dogs, literally. I'm talking the animals, not metaphorically for a really torrential rain. We're literally going to see the four-legged animals falling from the sky, because that's how God works. With certain things where a lot of people have a problem with, and we have to remember to be patient and to keep our faith and know that God will provide and fulfill His promises. A lot of the oaths and promises that God makes, He doesn't set out a time frame for. God tells us through His Torah that eventually the Messiah will come, and that the world will be perfected. Okay, and we're still waiting for that. I know personally, I pray, it's part of my prayers, I pray for it every day. Please God, send Moshiach right now. Please God, right now, please let this be the day. Okay, though every day I wait for Messiah, and though He may tarry, I still await His arrival every day. That's what we have to do. You have to keep that hope alive and that faith alive, that tells you that you always have, God said this would happen, so it's going to happen. In this situation, in a lot of situations, He doesn't say when it's going to happen, but He says it will happen. So yeah, it will happen. And with that, I shall draw this to a close. Do either of you guys have any questions on anything we covered tonight, or anything Judaism in general, or just anything you just want to ask me? Have at it. Open floor right here. Oh, there's a comment I didn't see before. Does providence change the moral meaning, or is a place where only omnipotent can make the call, yet the evil remains evil? That, to me, that's a question like, one of these yes with a if, no with a but type thing. I would say, however, that evil remains an evil, but Hashem made evil, and therefore it does serve a purpose in the world. Thank you, Darian. You answered that perfectly. There's nothing I can really add to that. That brilliant answer. Thank you. That was a good one. I'm gonna have to write that down. Yeah, evil does serve a purpose in the world. Obviously, I'm sure we all think that, well, why does evil have to happen? It's basically evil is basically can be seen as a result of free will in a way. You have the free will to do good, and you have the free will to do not so good or evil in this point. And I think about it this way: if we lived in a world where evil didn't exist, I'm not trying to justify evil here or say that evil is a good thing, but if we lived in a world where evil did not exist in some way, shape, or form, after a while, couldn't we possibly, conceivably, lose the ability to appreciate good? If that's all we can do is good. If something becomes robotic in a way, or like programmed to you, where it's all you can do. If all you are able to do is good, then is it, I mean, yeah, it's okay, it's good in a way, but is it very good if that's all you can do? Or does the ability to possibly do evil make that good even better? Because, we have our free will, and you have the ability to choose, I could do this, which is maybe not so good, could be considered an evil act, and it might even be the easier thing to do or the more pleasing thing to do. But you know what? I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to do the good thing. That takes, in Hebrew, it's called tov, means good. Okay? It takes what the tov and makes it tov ma'od, which in Hebrew means very good. So, one works as a complement to the other in a way. Aubrey says, I just keep thinking that the words Vayechi were written in the 13th century CE, and we still wait. What is the meaning of Joseph's example in the interim, where we have to live in the world where we wait? Yeah, Vayechi, I believe it was written by the Rambam in 13th century. I believe it's part of the 13 principles of Jewish faith. What is the meaning of Joseph's example in the interim, where we have to live in a world where we wait? That is a really, really good question. I'm actually kind of stumped on that. If anybody else wants to chime in, help me out here, I'd appreciate it very much, because that is a really, really good question. What is the meaning of Joseph's example in the interim, where we have to live in the world where we wait? Off the top of my head, I would say it's just the idea is that, it presses home, the idea of trusting God, I guess. If you have to wait for something and you wait for a really long time, but you still keep patiently waiting and still keep patiently believing, once it finally comes to pass and happen, it's like, well, see, there you go. Aren't you glad you waited? That's, off the top of my head, from almost a secular viewpoint, that, I can, have some attempt at interpreting that. If with all you guys' questions and everything, if you want to be in contact with me, my name is the first in the chat log there. That is my Facebook. Feel free to friend me, and you can be in contact with me and email me any questions you have, and I'll actually be able to give you a lot better in-depth answer rather than just an on-the-spot, just testing my Torah knowledge off the top of my head. I'll be able to really, really look into it and hopefully provide you guys with an answer that on some things that could be more helpful. Anybody else have any other questions before I sign this out? While I'm waiting for you guys to formulate any more questions that you have, I will say that here at OneShul, we ask a $5 donation if you attend a class. We just ask you for $5, which is just like a Starbucks, price of a Starbucks. We ask for that, $5 per class, because we do run on donations here, and your donations do keep us going, and it takes about a couple $100 a month to keep OneShul up and running. And the more donations we get means the more money we can have for things, which means more Jewish goodness brought to you online for free anytime you anytime you need it, and anytime you want to have it. What do we got here? Darian says, waiting, striving, and hoping for a result yields great things. We do good things now, like charity, in expectation and preparation of Olam Haba. Journey is often as fantastic as the destination. that is very true. That well said. Thank you so much for that. Thank you very much. I'm not trying to ask intractable questions. It's just these are the ones that occupy me. Perhaps they're so intractable. No, don't worry about it at all, Aubrey. That's the great questions like that are most fun to deal with. I feel because they're the most challenging, and that's all part of the Jewish experience too. We're one of the only faiths and religions that encourages you to ask questions, to question everything we're taught. As Jacob, our patriarch, who we just spoke about here at length tonight, as he wrestled with the divine, so we are also to wrestle in our minds with the divine word. Always ask questions. Never take anything at face value, because even a genius asks questions, and that's how we learn. And through asking questions, even the hard ones that may take a little while to answer, that's how we further our faith. And when we further our faith and everything, it helps not only the Jewish people, and our mission and our purpose here in this world is to be a light unto the nations, but it also, helps the world in general. So always ask your questions, even the ones that are really hard and take a little while in future correspondence to answer. Always ask them. There's no such thing as a bad question or an inappropriate question because it's too hard. And with that, everyone, I'm going to draw this to a close. I will leave you with a little amusing story that happened just the other day. I was speaking with my father-in-law, who is a very devout Pentecostal Christian, and he, obviously, we all know they got a pretty big holiday for them coming up tomorrow, and I was speaking with him, and he mentioned, about, just saying to me in a joking manner, because obviously, he knows I'm Jewish and everything, and he says, remember who was born on December 25th, a whole lot of years ago. And I'm like, oh yeah, there was I said to him, I go, yeah, Pop, there was a great man born on December 25th, many years ago. This man was born on December 25th. Through his life, he gave so much to the world, changed the world forever. Tragically, his life was cut short way too soon, and he died way too young. And hearing that coming from a Jewish man, my father-in-law just like look at me with a big grin on his face, because he knows that something offbeat is coming. And he says to me, he goes, and who was that man? And I'm like, well, it was the great Hollywood actor Humphrey Bogart, who was born on December 25th, 1899. He was a great man. He gave so much to the world, and his life was tragically cut short, and he died way too young. Now, fortunately, I could get away with that. I could get away with that joke because my father-in-law is a very cool guy. I love the guy to death, and he's able to take a joke, especially on topics like that. And he knows me. He knows that I can be a goofball and a prankster and a jokester. So he took that well. There are certain people who wouldn't try that joke with, though. So if you guys want to use that, just use it with caution and discretion, okay? And with that, I don't think I'll be with you guys next week, is because it's New Year's Eve, and I have a prior engagement that I have to attend to, so I'll probably see you guys. I will definitely see you guys again the following Monday, which will be after New Year's. So I'd like to wish you guys all a very, very happy and safe welcoming of 2013 CE. Hope you guys all had a really good 2012 CE. I know for me it was amazing and a year just full of blessings. I hope it was the same for you guys, and I wish you guys a very, very happy and safe New Year's celebration. Ahava and shalom to all of you guys. Thank you so much for being here, and as always, you know I love each and every one of you. Please feel free to be in contact with me. Okay, everybody, you have a wonderful rest of the evening, and have a good night, everybody.